listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the mother of all talk shows tonight on Halloween. George has been taken off the air, albeit temporarily due to the bad weather here in the UK. His train has been severely delayed tonight, and he'll be joining us in the studio as soon as he arrives here in London. I'm Simon, your sound man tonight. Stay with us for the next 3 hours, and at some point when George arrives, we'll restart the show with some top guests. Don't go anywhere, because up next is an interview George did recently with Pink Floyd founder Roger Waters about Prince Andrew and friend of the show, Stephen Dosiger. This is the mother of all talk shows, In the Dark on Halloween.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Now, I'm sorry we didn't get him last week, but we're very, very honoured to have the great Roger Waters with us now. Roger, welcome to the mother of all talk shows. We have at least two mutual friends in common, and I'd like to speak about both of them. But first up has to be Stephen Dosiger, who, as I explained at the beginning of the show, although regular viewers and listeners already know this because Stephen has been on the show several times, this has all been done to him by a private company. No state legal process has been present in this at all. And yet our friend Stephen is this evening, I presume, unless he's appealing and still at large, behind bars in a prison. Explain, if you would, how such a thing could possibly happen.
Well, he's not. It's good to see you, George.
And you're
he's not behind bars in a prison. At the very end of the proceedings on Monday, which I attended, the defense were given 1 week to make a bail. I think it's a bail appeal again, but I'm not entirely clear because. Anyway, suffice it to say, there is 1 more week in order for his team to make arguments, which they will, and they will be cogent, and they will be correct, and they will be germane to his predicament, and they will make no difference to Judge Preska because she doesn't respond to anything but the advice and orders of her paymasters, who are Chevron Corporation.
Well, there's a remarkable series of conflicts of interest, as indeed there are in the Assange case, in this whole affair. But just to summarize, Chevron were ordered to pay billions of dollars to the victims of their human and environmental damage in Ecuador. They refused to pay it, haven't paid a penny, and instead have managed to have the lawyer for the victims of Chevron imprisoned, first at home and, unless we're lucky, in the next week, in a prison.
Yeah. And they did it by finding a tame judge on the Southern Circuit of New York Southern Circuit, Judge Louis A. Kaplan, back in 2012. And then they hired a defrocked, crooked judge from Ecuador to give evidence against Stephen Dosiger and suggest that he had been responsible for fraudulently obtaining the judgment against Chevron, which was $9.5 billion, as you rightly point out. It's probably about 12 billion now, with penalties and interest and so on and so forth. And this man, Guerra, who has since recanted his testimony to the civil RICO trial that happened back in 2013, based entirely upon Guerra's evidence, Stephen was found guilty of being a racketeer, and which, of course, he isn't. He's a human rights lawyer. He has been ever since he left Harvard Law School 23 years ago. And he's been fighting this fight almost that entire time on behalf of 30,000 indigenous rainforest dwellers in Ecuador, whom I have visited with him. in Ecuador a few years ago. So the whole thing is completely trumped up and iniquitous. And you're completely correct in saying that the district attorney, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York refused to prosecute him on the recent charade, which was a contempt of court case where he was held in contempt because he refused to hand over his laptop computer and his iPhone to Chevron Corporation on the grounds that it contravened client privilege with 30,000 poor Ecuadorian people who still need his help. And they had him disbarred, even though when the disbarment went to a referee, he's called John Horn, and John Horan, and he was the referee. His recommendation after a 3-day hearing in New York City was that Stephen Donziger's license to practice law should be immediately returned to him. And the whole thing should be struck from his record because, in his opinion, the referee, Donziger, was innocent of any wrongdoing. So there we go.
Joseph Heller, Catch-22 couldn't encapsulate that story. If Kafka himself could not do so. Here is the lawyer for the people whose lives were ruined, who were granted almost $10 billion in compensation from an oil company. And that oil company has managed to get the lawyer for the 30,000 people locked up. Not in Ecuador, no disrespect intended to Ecuador, but in the United States. Now, in a sane world, Chevron's name would be mud, its share price crashing, and every liberal and progressive, the New York Times would be running this on their front page. It would be pussy hat heaven. All the liberals would be out on the streets. Where are they?
Let's not accuse the New York Times of being either liberal or progressive, George, or they'll think this is a comedy show. You know, obviously they're not. They labor under the yoke of the ruling class and the powers that be and the status quo and all of that. But it is interesting that this is becoming more and more visible, and support for Stephen Donziger all over the world is growing hand over fist. So how long the US Department of Justice and the US judiciary in general will be able to handle the embarrassment of Louis A. Kaplan and Loretta Preska, who are federal judges in the Southern District of New York. The embarrassment of them being who and what they are, I don't know, but I hope for not much longer. And certainly the rumblings are beginning to be just discernible in the DOJ. So we may see some movement. This story is not over. My great hope, it's not my belief, because they are so entrenched, these corrupt officials, and they have such enormous power. Do you know, if you're appointed as a federal judge, you can never be removed, is the law of the United States. It doesn't matter what you do. It's for life.
Well,
which is a strange thing for an appointee. This is not an elected. Nobody is elected to sit on the federal bench. So, anyway,
well, let's segue to another bench closer to home. Julian Assange has been through a process, although more judicial on the face of it, no less Kafkaesque than Stephen. And he is facing not 6 months in jail, but the rest of his life. In fact, 4 lifetimes, 145 years in a Guantanamo super prison in Colorado. And yet the same, not the New York Times, but if you like, their British equivalents, still appear to be entirely unmoved by it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Are we living in great times, George, where we, the people, get to notice that what we're looking at is a house of cards, and that every single one of those cards that builds that flimsy pyramid that we call the powers that be, or the status quo, or our governments, is beginning to bend and buckle. And it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more of us that the emperor has no clothes, that this system that we live under, capitalist system in the West, makes no sense, i.e. a world where we take no notice of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from Paris in 1948, or from 1789 in Paris. We pay lip service to it, but we don't act upon it at all, or certainly our governments don't. And I think we, the people, are beginning to say, whoa, hold on a minute, this just is wrong, you know? And so the worm is turning, if I may refer to myself as a worm. And we will have our way at the end of the day. Now, whether we do it in time to save Stephen his 6 months of stir, and to save Julian Assange's life, because that's what they're doing. They're trying to impose a death sentence on our friend Julian, one of the great heroes of our time, one of the very few, very, very truthful, honest, and brilliant publishers and journalists that we have. He is our fourth estate. He is the check and balance against the malfeasance of errant authority. Julian Assange embodies it. And yet they've managed to get large numbers of the general public, as well as themselves, to wrinkle their noses by smearing him with terrible slanders about his sex life or his personal cleanliness or whatever it might be. Julian Assange is a great hero, and we must build statues to him.
Indeed.
Not just free him,
but honor him. He's a world historic figure. I agree entirely with that. But here's an irony. The liberal press, including the New York Times and the Guardian and others around the world, are this evening running their presses, if presses still run, I don't know, exposing the horrific, obscene levels of wealth and corruption in the Pandora's box revelations. Some of the mightiest figures in the land, in the world, are revealed to be even more rotten than we already thought that they were. This information has been leaked to these newspapers in the way that information even more important about war crimes and the rest were leaked to WikiLeaks. They have been published by these great newspapers as they were published by WikiLeaks. Yet the publisher of WikiLeaks faces 145 years, and the publishers of the Pandora's Box will be looking to receive journalistic awards at the end of this year. How do we square this?
Pulitzer Prizes for the lot of them, obviously. Well, you know, they've come back into line. In Julian's case, they've gone, whoa, maybe if we do exactly as we're told from now, i.e. if we never publish a word about Julian Assange and how appallingly badly, or voice the opinion that this is a total travesty of justice, or what, maybe that we can go on doing what it is that we do, which is to serve them. So they are servants of the rich and powerful, all of them. I make no bones about calling the Manchester Guardian that as well. Having been looking at that paper since I was a wee lad, you know. So how do you explain the paradox? The whole thing is upside down. We're living in Alice's Wonderland. We're down the rabbit hole. Nothing makes any sense. It gets curiouser and curiouser. But what can we do about it? We can do what you're doing, and what I try and do as well, is we shout about it, stand on the rooftops and shout as loud as we can and call them the crooked arseholes that they are, our leaders, that they won't stand up and do what is right. You know, I've often told this story about people say, how did you develop these opinions? My mother, when I was 13 years old, struggling with something or other, she sat me down and she said, you know, Roger, through your whole life, you're going to be faced with difficult decisions to make about complex problems and whatever. My advice to you is study whatever it may be from all sides that you can. Just before I came here and got on the Zoom link with you, I was reading as much as I could about the Pandora revelations, which are coming out. I haven't got very far because there's thousands of pages, apparently. Anyway, my mother said to me, study it, listen to other opinions, really verse yourself in it. When you've done that, you've done all the heavy lifting. The end bit is the easiest thing in the world. And I went, well, what's that, Mum? And she said, do the right thing.
Well, you've certainly done that. Let's go.
No, but they don't. It wouldn't occur to them to do the right thing. They do the expedient thing from their point of view, which is to maintain power and blah, blah, blah. But they don't. They never do the right thing. So that's a big difference.
No, they're doing the right thing by their immoral selves. Now, you made the point that how long can the US justice system ignore this elephant in the room of a private oil company rampaging through their legal system? Isn't the same true now on the Biden administration in persisting with their appeal against the refusal to extradite Julian Assange? After all, talk about a case turning sour. In fact, foul, never mind sour. The top witnesses are discredited. The illegal spying activities that spied on me, no doubt you, spied on Julian 24/7, even in the toilet in the Ecuador embassy, the end user of that illegally obtained material, the spying on Julian's privileged conversations with his own lawyers about this very case that would be likely to come down the track. I mean, time does not allow me to adumbrate all the reasons why not only this case should be thrown out of court in England, but should be discontinued in Washington. Do you think there's any prospect of the Biden administration being so embarrassed by all this? After all, it was Donald Trump's work. Why not drop it?
Well, yes, I do believe that there is a possibility that that might happen because these people are pragmatic, if nothing else. And certainly if Joe Biden or Joe Biden's advisors or Merrick Garland, for instance, who's the Attorney General, as you know, in the United States now, if it suddenly dawned on them that maybe actually this might be to their advantage and that they could make some political hay out of it, or that it was getting so nasty, the smell was so disgusting that it was going to leave it a taste on them and harm their reputations, then they would. Would Joe Biden do this because it's the right thing to do? No. Joe Biden couldn't care less about the right thing or about human rights or anything else. He is a pragmatic, professional politician. You only have to look at his record over the last 50. Don't forget, Joe Biden wrote the Patriot Act, more or less single-handedly. And it failed to become part of their legislature or legislation until 9/11, when suddenly it was brought out of the closet and they dusted it. This thing young Biden wrote in 1994 or whenever it was. So, yeah, there is a chance, and I cling to the possibility that Biden will free us, will stop the extradition proceedings. Because if Biden drops the extradition proceedings, the British government won't be able to keep Julian Assange in prison any longer. They won't have a single prop to continue that disgusting fact, which it is now. He's been in prison for nearly 3 years, for God's sake, in Belmarsh prison. I know you know all this, but so yeah, I do believe that people like you and me and Julian Assange and Stephen Donziger and Craig Murray and all the rest of us can have some effect on them.
I agree. I look forward
look
to...
what happened at the Labour Party conference last week, where Labour Party members turned round in England at their annual conference and produced this document where they advocate the applying of sanctions to the state of Israel on the grounds that it's apartheid. How can Keir Starmer not have resigned? I don't get any. I know I'm changing the subject.
No, you're not. You really are not. It was extraordinary. The Labour Party passed a policy which is illegal under the party's rules. It's illegal to call Israel an apartheid state. You get auto-expelled for it. Yet the Labour conference passed a resolution calling it just that. Well, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably an apartheid duck. Thank you.
Probably is.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger Waters. Hats off to you.
George.
You are one of the heroes of our age. Thank you for
thank you for having me on.
Radio Sputnik.
If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 0808196 5522. If you're in the United States, it's +1 844 944 3344. Let me hear from you.
I was just listening to your previous callers about the manufacturing of consent.
Yeah.
People are powerless. They're drowning in a cocktail of confusion and they just don't know what to do, and they know no one's speaking up for them.
It's bristling out there amongst the white English working class. They feel that Labour hates them and they hate Labour back.
I think the idea of this capitalism thing that we have limited respect for, which is linked with freedom compared to like a strict socialist, people going on to welfare and not being able to work. And I feel like that almost the world, this great reset and build back better and all these key words that come out with country leaders all over the world, it seems to me to be a little bit worrying.
No, you shouldn't be any more worried than you were before, but you shouldn't be any less worried than you were before either.
If you're a lawyer, which unfortunately, what's his name? Keir Starmer is. He's spending all of his time being right about everything. You know, he can't appeal to every community. It's not good enough. It really isn't good enough. You know, there were 4 other candidates and they were all better than him.
Why has the Labour Party failed so miserably? I mean...
Well, the Labour Party has fallen out of love with the British people, and the British people have reciprocated.
Yeah, but don't you think Labour had some part to play in that, though, with the whole classism thing? I mean, like, you're supposed to be old Labour, right? You went against new Labour, inverted commas. So don't you think it's on people like you to promote actual Labour policies or whatever?
No, why should I? What do I owe the Labour Party, Dan?
Labour Party or whatever.
I think the Labour Party is a catastrophic disaster.
Do something about it then. Why are you complaining about it? Why don't you do something about it, right? Instead of complaining.
But Dan obviously doesn't know that I'm actually the leader of a rival political party and stand against the Labour Party in elections.
And George, do you know something else?
You're not going to sing again, are you?
For the last time you spoke to me, you ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
You've actually got a great voice.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Now, if you thought the FBI didn't fancy Prince Andrew very much, they are reportedly seeking to interview him, and he is more than reportedly, but actively seeking to avoid them. You should read what they had to say about Lord Louis Mountbatten, who came to, of course, a very tragic end, along with children and others, when the IRA blew up a boat that he was sailing off the coast of his estate in the Republic of Ireland. And no disrespect is intended to that disgraceful ending. But the lifetime of Mountbatten was seeded with the most loathsome corruption. The FBI warned the American government not to have anything to do with the man who was once the supreme commander of the Allied war effort in the Pacific. He was the last viceroy of India. He presided over the catastrophic division of India into two states, India and Pakistan. He was present in the 1970s, during the government of Harold Wilson, seditious discussions that centred on a military coup to overthrow the Labour government of Harold Wilson and put the very same Lord Louis Mountbatten in charge of a government of national unity, effectively a junta, overthrowing the elected government of Great Britain. He was a rum character, even on the basis of the books that I've read, some of them written by our next guest. I've even read his Stalin's Englishman, a wonderful book about Guy Burgess. He's a top literary agent and a top author, and his name is Andrew Loney. Meet him now. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. The proximate reason for this discussion is that you're trying to open up to the public information about Mountbatten that is being ruthlessly suppressed. Please tell us about it.
Well, that's right. There have been two official lives of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten, and those lives quoted quite extensively from their diaries and letters. So when I began researching my book in 2015, I asked to see these letters and diaries. The whole collection of Mountbatten papers had been bought by the University of Southampton with public funds and under the acceptance in lieu scheme to be seen by the public for close to £5 million. And I was surprised, therefore, to find that they knew nothing about these diaries or letters. Well, eventually, after a 6-year fight through the tribunals, having put in numerous Freedom of Information requests and having had the Information Commissioner rule that these diaries and letters had been closed quite illegally and should be opened to me and to indeed any other person who wanted to see them. That decision was made in 2019, but the Cabinet Office, who somehow seemed to have got themselves involved in this, and Southampton University appealed, and we're still fighting to get these diaries and letters, which I think are an important source, revealed. Some material, after parliamentary pressure and media pressure, has been released, but there's still the diary, for example, for 1947, covering Indian independence, and the papers after 1960, which remain closed, and plus other gaps during the Second World War. It was almost an unprecedented occurrence in that Southampton University were actually charged with contempt of court by the Information Commissioner. They've now been basically fighting a very expensive legal battle to prevent me seeing this. It's cost me £250,000 in legal costs, and it must have cost them quite considerably more. But neither the Cabinet Office nor Southampton are prepared to say what their costs are. And I think this is a very important case, not just for historians having access to archives, but it's an example of the censorship of our history by those in power and the abuse of a government to prevent material which has been bought by public funds from being seen. in effect, 4.5 million was spent buying it, and another million probably has been spent stopping people seeing it.
What do you think it is they're trying to hide, Andrew?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, from what I can see of the material I have read, it's all completely innocuous. So I can only imagine that what they've now kept back is where the juicy stuff is, or that they're simply seeking to make an example of someone to prevent anyone else in future trying to seek access to material. But what's very clear is that the royal household are involved in this. They've been going to meetings, they're copied into correspondence. And we know, for example, that one of the reasons the delays in sending some of this material into the archive was dealing with Prince Philip's death. So it just seems to me that we're living in a banana republic. We're not allowed to know our own history.
Alas, it's not a republic. The royal family are clearly, I mean, what other reason could Southampton University have, having expended millions of taxpayers' pounds on these archives, have for not allowing the public to see them, other than royal pressure?
Well, I think they're kowtowing exactly to government and royal pressure. One of the other scandals is that they're now admitting that no one had actually looked at this material before it was closed. The only person who'd seen it and who made the decision to close it was an archivist at Southampton, who then requested that he could edit the diary himself. And the Cabinet Office gave him that permission. But this diary was due to come out next year, but again, no one will say if this diary is going ahead or not. And indeed, parliamentary questions have been answered with lies. They either claim it's sub judice, which is the lie now, or they've said that there were undertakings given by Mountbatten in 1969 which allowed them to basically censor this material. But it was pointed out to them that these 1969 undertakings don't refer to individual diaries and private letters. They refer to government papers from his time as Chief of the Defence Staff. So time after time, they've told lies. When they're caught out, they just tell different lies.
Now, Mountbatten, as I know, not least from your own work, despite being a luminary of the state, could scarcely have been for people d'un certain âge like me. We were brought up to understand that Mountbatten, with the flashy television series about his life and so on, was some kind of a British hero. But that wasn't the whole story, was it?
No, I mean, he curated his legend, and you mentioned the 12-part series on the Life and Times. And again, his story was censored. One of the things I found in the course of researching my book, The Mountbattens, was the FBI file that you mentioned from 1943, talking about his penchant for young boys, and that he was a man of very low morals, they called him. I began to find more and more about this. I have a whole chapter about his paedophilia and his bisexuality, which of course was illegal at the time. He was sacking people from the Navy for the very offence that he was committing himself. And people in authority knew all about it. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that when he went to Malta and just after the war, his chauffeur was tasked by his superior officer, or former officer, to find out where the male brothel was in Malta, because he would want to go there. But I think the other shocking thing I discovered was when I asked for other FBI files relating to Mountbatten, only a few years ago, I was told that they'd been destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I was told after I'd asked for them.
Well, has the benefit of being candid, that answer. To be called a person of low morals by J. Edgar Hoover must have meant his morals were really very low. In a way, in ordinary terms, that would be none of our business, except, as you say, some of his proclivities were actually illegal at the time, and he was drumming people out of the armed forces for crimes he was committing virtually on a daily basis. But as we no longer regard these things as crimes, depending on age, of course, and consent, it only really matters to us in historical terms if it impinged on his military and political role, which it did in the case of India and the subsequent partition, didn't it?
Well, I mean, he, of course, was always open to blackmail. And indeed, I didn't use this material in the book, but there were suggestions from Russian KGB agents that he had been compromised. I have found no evidence to support that, so I didn't use it. But you say it doesn't matter, but, you know, there are victims still alive, still coming to terms with the abuse that they suffered from him. And there's still the cover-up. The Garda have admitted that they have the car logs for August 1977 when two of these boys I interviewed were abused, but they're refusing to release them on the grounds they are relevant to the 1979 murder inquiry. I think the other question is why his security was reduced in 1979 when the threat against him was heightened and he had been actually warned not to go to Ireland. But you come to the question of India. I think what these diaries may well show us is that he was far less impartial than he should have been as viceroy, and that Pakistan may well have good reason to feel that they were unjustly done by. So, you know, there are important
because of Mountbatten's wife, Lady Edwina's brazen affair, maybe even literally under the nose of Louis, with the Indian leader Nehru.
Yes, and I think the two questions are, when did the affair start? Did it start after the independence or before it? And I think all the evidence that I found suggested it began before, and also whether it was platonic, as the family claim, or a sexual relationship, which I believe. I think there's no doubt Mountbatten knew about the affair very early on, and he encouraged it. It suited his purposes as it suited Nehru's and Edwina's purposes. One of the other battles is to get released the literally hundreds of letters between Nehru and Edwina, written between 1947 and her death in 1960. Southampton are supposed to have exercised their option on those letters by the 5th of August this year, and yet they've made no statement about them. They've not been made publicly available, and they're not answering questions about that.
Now, to ask the famous question asked by Paul Daniels, asked of Paul Daniels' wife, what first attracted Lord Mountbatten to his frequent trips to Ireland? Because, as you say, on the face of it, a member of the British royal family, frequently holidaying in the Republic of Ireland when there was a war going on, would seem strange. I detect from things that you've written and things I've heard elsewhere that he was involved in very murky business indeed in Ireland.
Well, the family home that he inherited from his wife, who inherited from her relations, Classieborne, was where they went on holiday every year. But you're right, other members of the royal family were not allowed to go to the Republic, and he was warned on many occasions that he shouldn't go. There have been several attempts on his life before 1979. Indeed, there had been an attempt to put a bomb on his boat Shadow 5 the previous year, which is why not guarding it in 1979 seems extraordinary. But there have been rumours, I didn't put them in my book, but I heard a lot of stories that he didn't want much security in Classieborne because he wanted the freedom to be on holiday, but also, of course, the freedom to not be watched with his activities. And certainly the two stories that I recount of the abusing of these boys, who are now about 60, took place at Classieborne or nearby.
Could he have been involved in the Kincora boys scandal?
Well, there are lots of rumours about that, and there are various connections. One of the boys that I interviewed who was abused was in Kincora and was brought from there. He was certainly well known in Belfast. And again, these car logs would be useful evidence to see that if actually one of the wardens at Kincora or some member of staff there had driven this boy to Classieborne. But there's certainly lots of stories about boys being trafficked to some of the big houses in the area. There was a sort of extensive VIP abuse ring operating on the west coast of Ireland.
It makes Prince Andrew's alleged offences almost trivial by comparison, the indictment against Mountbatten. Let me move on to political terrain, if I may. One of the reasons I have a particular interest in this is I knew Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson was a friend of mine after he left office, I should say. The fact that a junta was envisaged by certain high personages in the land to supplant, overthrow the elected government of Harold Wilson is possibly the biggest scandal of them all. And yet, most British people know nothing about Mountbatten's alleged role in that.
Yes, well, I think it's understandable because most of the paperwork has been destroyed and the people who knew about it are dead and didn't really talk about it in their lifetime. But I was able, by triangulating the correspondence of various people involved, to discover that he was much more actively involved than he later claimed, that he was very flattered by the approaches. He actually put forward various candidates for this government of national unity, including the head of the Hammer horror films, Jimmy Carreras. And he was a man who would have liked to have been Prime Minister, who felt frustrated as a member of the royal family that he couldn't take on political power. So I agree, this is one of the unknown stories of the 60s and 70s. There were two periods, really, one in 68 and then one later in 1970 when various MI5 officers were involved. But unfortunately, all those who would know anything are dead, and I suspect the papers will never be released. But certainly the diaries and letters that I looked at in the papers of Mountbatten and also of Cecil King and Hugh Cudlip had all been heavily censored for that period. There are actually gaps for the key dates.
You're a historian, you're used to archives and so on. I suspect a lot of the people watching and listening to this now will wonder, well, these people would just destroy, especially in those days before computers and hard drives and so on, these people would just destroy inconvenient papers and evidence.
Of course, and that's one of the big problems that we historians have. But, documents are the lifeblood of historians. It's the building blocks in which we reconstruct our picture of the past. And we have a Public Records Act which requires these papers to be preserved, not necessarily private papers, but public papers. And the governments of all persuasions over many years have not fulfilled their obligations under the Public Records Act. They're abusing the use of freedom of information exemptions. They are, of course, all the sensitive documents are always the ones that suffer from damp and asbestos. And we know from countless scandals, including the Mau Mau scandal, that they will lie and destroy files or keep them back when they've even been taught by the courts to bring them forward. So it's a really big problem for historians. But you're right, of course, people who will curate their story and they will destroy papers that reflect badly on them. But that's why we have a Public Records Act, that at least the public records have some accurate picture of the past.
Is that going to become worse in the electronic age now that papers effectively no longer exist? Is that going to make life even harder for historians?
Yes, it's much harder for all sorts of reasons. Tony Blair introduced civil government, so instead of having civil servants taking minutes and records of things, it was all just casual chats, no records kept. And we have the problem of people using private emails. Michael Gove is notorious for it, and encrypted communications. So the records aren't being kept to start with, let alone being destroyed later. And it's very difficult. The Freedom of Information Act does cause problems because, of course, civil servants have to be able to give advice in confidence and not feel that in 20 years' time they're going to be in trouble for it. But we do have safeguards for that. But my worry is that the governments are hiding behind things like national security when there's no national security involved at all. It's just political embarrassment.
And what's the next stage then of your valiant battle for the right of the public to know? Where does this go now, the Southampton University matter?
Well, the hearing, which they've managed to kick down the road for 2 years, is finally being heard on the second week of November. We're expecting to win. They've actually now dropped many of the objections that they originally fought for 5 years, and they're no longer relying on those. And so we'll see what new excuses they come up with. But we're pretty confident of winning, and I'm pretty confident that I will get my costs. They're not normally given in a tribunal of this sort, but we've managed to produce pages of falsehoods that were given to us, and we think the judge will award costs in this case.
Radio Sputnik.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Now, I don't know about you, but I've spent decades paying money to somebody called McAfee. I actually never knew that it was a person, just a faceless corporation that I was paying money to protect my computer. So far, so good, but not for Mr. McAfee, for he was indeed a real person. McAfee, John McAfee, as we would call him in this country, McAfee as he's known in the United States, was, well, take your pick. Like Jeffrey Epstein, he may have genuinely committed suicide. Or like Jeffrey Epstein, the suicide may have come as a big surprise to him. One man has studied this matter in very great detail. He is the author and ghostwriter Mark Eglinton, and he joins us now. A ghostwriter, huh, Mark? I think you should write McAfee's posthumous memoirs. Tell us why you're interested and why we should be.
Well, let me explain and tell you that this book actually is his memoirs. John contacted me in 2019 while he was on the run and said, I want you to ghostwrite my autobiography. And that's what we agreed to do. However, given how complex his situation was, that situation changed halfway through the process when he wanted cryptocurrency from a publisher, didn't have an address to contact with, et cetera, et cetera. So he ended up pulling out of the project, leaving me with it. And this book that is coming out towards the end of the year is conversations between he and I, which are essentially his life story. So, I mean, when you say that I should ghostwrite his memoirs, I more or less have, because almost all the words are his. So that's where we are.
Why was he of interest to you?
I mean, John, I don't know how much the listeners know about John. John lived the most incredible life in every sense. I mean, the pre-McAfee years, before he even, I mean, the company he founded, which you referred to earlier, was founded by accident. He had no aspirations whatsoever to be a corporate figure. He was somebody who enjoyed living, and earning money was simply a means to continue living. And when he walked away from McAfee Associates in 1992, he didn't sell it. People think that he sold out. He didn't. He just walked away. But also what happened was he benefited greatly from the flotation of the company on the stock exchange at that time. So he had unlimited money, and from that point onward, he did basically what he wanted in life, built houses, traveled to foreign countries, literally got bounced around by the chaos of the world, which is easy to do, granted, if you have upwards of $100 million, but that's the kind of life he lived, and he was just fascinating. And I just thought, I couldn't believe he'd never written an autobiography. And the fact that he was on the run at the time when he was contacting me made it even more appealing. I just couldn't believe that there was a situation where I could write a book with a guy who was on the run. And that's what we did. So, yeah, that brings us to now. And sadly, John won't be here to read this book when it comes out later this year.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing for the sales or not. It's certainly a new layer of mystery, isn't it? He was a rum character, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, anyone who knows anything about John knows he went to Belize. They will know that he ran from Belize when he was being framed by the Belizean government while also being accused of a murder. A murder I firmly believe, based on all the conversations I had with him, he did not commit. Nevertheless, he faked a heart attack in Guatemala. He's faked a stroke elsewhere while on the run. This is a guy whose life force, even at the age of 74, which he was when I was talking to him, was undiminished. So, you know, people have asked me numerous times in the aftermath of his sad death, do I think that John committed suicide? And, you know, I'll never have the answer to that, the definitive answer. What I will say is that there was nothing in any of the conversations I ever had with him which suggested that he didn't want to keep living. You know, that's all I can say. All of his moves that he's made over the last 3 or 4 years have been designed to keep living. So that's all I can say about that part of it.
Well, can you say why there might be any doubt that he committed suicide?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, it's well known. He made it well known that he was being pursued by the CIA. He firmly believed that. He believed that, I mean, his stance on taxation in the US was one whereby he hadn't filed tax returns. Not only that, I mean, there's plenty of people who don't file tax returns, but he was going out on a public stage discussing cryptocurrency. Now, cryptocurrency, as some people might think, is a means of avoiding paying tax. He was going around on a yacht telling people, I haven't filed tax returns and here's how you don't have to either. And he believes that he became a problem to the US government to the extent that somebody might try and collect him. And he told me that on a number of occasions. And in fact, some of the conversations in the book are about his knowledge of the intricacies of how the CIA works. Because this is a man who supplied the CIA in his early days of McAfee Associates. He knew how that operation worked.
And where did he die, commit suicide, or was killed?
In a prison in Barcelona.
How was he, why was he in a prison in Barcelona?
Well, he was on the run when I was talking to him for the book that we did together. And what I didn't know at the time was that he was on the run in Spain. And at some point during 2020, he boarded a flight in Barcelona airport on a UK passport. He was a dual UK and US citizen and was apprehended by people presumably contracted by the US authorities on a flight to Istanbul. And from there, he was imprisoned in Barcelona pending deportation to the US.
And he made some kind of prediction, like others, that he would be suicided by the authorities, didn't he?
Yeah, the whacked theory is one that he put out there a year and a half before his death, to the extent he got a tattoo with whacked on his arm and posted on Twitter that if he is ever whacked, that he didn't do it. It would be, he was comparing his situation to Epstein and was indeed suggesting that Epstein didn't commit suicide. So yeah, he did kind of predict it. But this was the kind of thing John did. John was somebody who liked manipulating his public persona. He enjoyed doing that. It could easily be a red herring.
Yeah. Was there an investigation into his death? Was there a proper coroner's inquiry or the Catalan equivalent?
Well, things have been slow in Spain. He died on June the 23rd. There was an initial autopsy that ruled suicide, which was disputed by his wife, Janice, who's in Spain now. There's been various legal to and fro up to the point when the Spanish authorities, I think Spain shuts down in August, essentially for a holiday. And my understanding is that there is more to come from this in September, later on this month, in fact, when Spain opens up again. But it's certainly not resolved. I wouldn't like to say that this is resolved at this point. It's still very much open.
And how much of his $100 million did he get through, and how much does Janice stand to inherit?
He was broke. I said this to another source when I was asked after his death. I firmly believe John had no money when he died. And people say, oh, well, how can you have $100 million? And that was conservative, that number. But this is a guy, and as I said to you earlier, he enjoyed just living. And in the book, he talks about building houses in Ecuador, spending $25 million on a house that he never set foot in. He built half a dozen houses of this kind all over the US, in Hawaii, in Belize. Never bothered about even going to any of them or some of them. So this wasn't somebody who was bothered about spending money. And I believe that by the time he was imprisoned, he was basically bankrupt.
And does his wife think he was whacked?
She doesn't believe he committed suicide. And I, for the same reasons I don't. I mean, he was eternally positive. Her last communication with him was earlier that day, where he said, I love you, I'll talk to you tomorrow, type of thing. There was no suggestion that this was on his mind. And John's somebody who would be pretty honest about that kind of thing. I'm pretty sure that if he had this kind of thing on his mind, he wouldn't mind saying so, and he didn't.
Was he alone in his cell when he passed away?
He was. That part of it's a bit confusing. There was a cellmate who was with John during the time in prison. The cellmate was not there at the time of his death. That part of it is a bit cloudy, as is the aspect of the CCTV footage from the cell at the time. That's something that's still to come out.
So tell us about the book. What's it called? Where can we get it and when?
The book is called No Domain, The John McAfee Tapes. And basically this is John McAfee and I sitting down for over 6 months, and me talking about his life to him and him talking back. And John was a myth in the public eye, even a meme. But the John McAfee that I spoke to was the actual person. I'm convinced that I got a vision of him through these conversations nobody's ever seen before. And it's just fascinating. His insight into human nature, into cryptocurrency, into internet security, into privacy, the workings of government is just fascinating. And it will be out later this year. The publication date is to be confirmed, because obviously when he passed, we tried to move that date up, which we're still trying to do, but it will be later this year. I'm hoping November. And it will be available at all good bookstores, Amazon, all the usual bookstores, and I can't wait for people to read it.
You may have a big seller on your hands. Thank you very much, Mark Eglinton, author of and ghostwriter of No Domain. The
Radio Sputnik.
Pizza Express Woking. What is it you want? Oh, you want an ill-advised interview on the BBC? A cheese pizza, extra immature, and a raw bailout. No, we don't take taxpayers' money. Yeah, but we do take contactless. Would you like a receipt for that, Mr. Prince?
Mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Radio Sputnik News.
The leaders of the world's richest economies have agreed to pursue efforts to limit global warming with meaningful and effective actions. Exactly how this will be achieved was not revealed in the leaders' communiqué at the G20 summit in Rome. Host nation Italy had hoped that firm targets would be set before the COP26 summit in Glasgow, which began today. The G20 group, made up of 19 countries and the European Union, accounts for 80% of the world's emissions. The communiqué also makes no reference to achieving net zero by 2050, which many countries have already pledged to do, and climate scientists say is critical to avoid a climate catastrophe. The communiqué does pledge, however, to stop financing new unabated coal plants internationally by the end of this year. A strong message to coal-reliant nations such as China, Russia and India, but the G20 leaders stopped short of agreeing to end coal power in their own nation. Malawi's president had a strong message to the rich developed nations that are yet to meet a promise to pay £100 billion to poorer countries each year to deal with climate change. Quote, "It's not a charity act, so pay up or perish with us," Lazarus Chakwera told BBC Africa. As long ago as 2009, the developed world pledged that it would mobilise that sum by 2020 to help less developed countries deal with the effects of climate change and build greener economies. But this target has still not been achieved, and the UK government, which is hosting this summit, now says it's unlikely to be until 2023. Many travellers to COP26 in Glasgow chose to make the journey by rail as a more environmentally friendly option, but hundreds were left at London's Euston Station due to cancelled trains. A tree which fell in strong winds damaged overhead wires in Northamptonshire, meaning all trains are suspended, including Avanti West Coast trains to Glasgow. Another fallen tree in Peterborough caused delays to LNER trains to Scotland from King's Cross, but the company says the line has now reopened with some delays expected until the end of the day. Environmental campaigner Greta Thunberg has defended the tactics of activists who have blocked roads, saying, quote, "Sometimes you need to anger people." Thunberg, who is in Glasgow for the COP26 summit, told the BBC it was important to ensure no one was hurt. It comes after Insulate Britain protesters have repeatedly brought major roads to a standstill. The 18-year-old activist was surrounded by police, media and supporters when she arrived for the climate change summit in Glasgow by train on Saturday evening. It's up to France to solve the ongoing fishing row with the UK by stepping back from threats over access to ports, the UK government has said. Prime Minister Boris Johnson met the French President Emmanuel Macron today to discuss continuing tensions around permits for French fishing boats. French officials said the pair had agreed to work together in the next hours and days on a solution. But later, a spokesperson for Johnson said no measures had been agreed. Instead, the official statement on behalf of the Prime Minister said he had, quote, reiterated his deep concern over the rhetoric emanating from the French government in recent days, including the suggestion by the French Prime Minister that the UK should be punished for leaving the EU. And it said the Prime Minister had expressed his hope that the French government would de-escalate this rhetoric and withdraw their threats. The PM spokesperson then went further, adding, "It's down to France to decide if they want to step away from the deeply concerning threats. We are not seeking to escalate this. We would welcome if they de-escalate and withdraw the threats they have made. It will be for the French to decide," said the statement. Actor Alec Baldwin has spoken publicly for the first time since the accidental fatal shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of a Western film Rust, calling it a 1 in a trillion episode. The actor and his wife Hilaria stopped to speak to reporters on a roadside in Vermont, and while Baldwin said he could not comment on the ongoing investigation, he said that Hutchins was, quote, "my friend." Gunmen who identified themselves as Taliban attacked a wedding in eastern Afghanistan to stop music being played, killing at least 2 people and injuring 10 others, officials say. A Taliban spokesperson said 2 of the 3 gunmen had been arrested but denied they had acted on behalf of the Islamist movement. Music was banned when the Taliban ruled the country from 1996 to 2001. The new authorities have not yet issued such a decree. An eyewitness said that 4 couples were being married in a joint wedding in a province of Nangarhar on Friday. They had taken permission from a local Taliban leader to play recorded music in an area used only by women, but late at night, the gunmen forced their way inside and tried to smash the loudspeakers. When the guests protested, the armed men opened fire. More than 160 buildings in a Myanmar town have been destroyed in fires caused by shelling from government troops. According to local media, tensions between Myanmar's military junta and opposing militia forces have continued continued to grow since the army seized power from the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi in February. Now footage has emerged showing burning buildings in an area located in the northwestern Chin state, with flames and thick billowing smoke rising into the air. A man has died after being gored at a bull running festival in Spain, authorities said. The 55-year-old was repeatedly attacked by the animal at the event in Onda in eastern Spain on Saturday, according to the town's council. He suffered a wound to his left leg and a head wound and bled to death from his injuries, according to emergency services. At least 9 people have been killed in a car bombing near an airport in Yemen's temporary capital, Aden. Another 12 people are believed to have been injured in Saturday's explosion, described as a terrorist bombing by Prime Minister Muin Abdulmak Saeed. Eyewitnesses say women and children are among the casualties. So far, no one has claimed responsibility. The country's internationally recognised government has been based in Aden since 2014, when the Houthi rebels forced them from the capital, Sana'a. The fighting has reportedly left more than 110,000 people dead, triggered the world's worst humanitarian disaster with millions on the brink of famine, and left the country even more vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, a sealed Super Mario Bros. 2 video game from 1988, found at the back of a walk-in cupboard in the US state of Indiana, has sold for more than $88,000, according to the auction house handling the sale. It said the item was found in near-mint condition in a box of video games in the crowded cupboard, which was part of a deceased estate in Floyd Knobs, Indiana. At an online auction last week, the item sold for $88,550, including the buyer's premium. Games from Super Mario, a series first released in 1985, have been fetching record-breaking prices in the past couple of years. In July, a copy of Super Mario 64 sold for over $1.5 million, the most ever paid for a video game. It broke the record set at the same auction for another Nintendo game, The Legend of Zelda, which fetched $870,000. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
You are watching a most unusual edition of the mother of all talk shows. Unusual for several reasons. First of all, our American viewers and listeners are just joining us now because of the change of clocks. They missed the first hour of the show, but mind you, so did I. I was going to talk about the nightmare journey, which included false imprisonment on a train with no air, no water, and the doors locked, sitting in Northampton station, with people beginning to, well, faint was the least of it. We had a pregnant woman, we had several people who seemed to be suffering from claustrophobic anxiety. It was baking hot, and there we were looking through a locked window at a railway station which was full of fresh air, but they would not let us out, even though we were 3.5 hours late on our journey. I was going to talk about the inadequacies, the negligence, the total bankrupt failure of Arriva West Coast trains, but I'll leave that till next week when I want to have a proper deep dive into the transport situation in this country. We have the farcical situation where we have the big COP environmental conference going on in Glasgow, and the entire British press corps was unable to get there because of, well, water on the line or trees bringing down overhead power cables, because, of course, rain on the 31st of October came as a complete surprise to Britain's railway companies. I was going to talk about it at length tonight, but breaking news means that it would not be seemly to do so. There is a report of a train crash with fire engines and ambulances racing to the scene near Andover, I think. I've no idea how serious a train crash it is, but out of respect to those caught up in a much more serious situation on the railway than the one I have just been through, I will leave that to breaking news, and we'll discuss Britain's trains next week. But I warn you, Arriva West Coast, Avanti West Coast, I keep mixing up the insurance company. Maybe I'm preparing my legal case against Avanti Trains. I warn you, Avanti Trains, I'm not going to go easy on you. I told you tonight that I was almost lost for words, but I won't be lost for words next Sunday. So the long and the short of all that was, I'm an hour late for my show also, and I really thank my colleagues in the studio for the emergency action that they had to take in interrupting normal programs. And of course, it goes without saying, I'm very grateful to the audience for sticking with us. We've been doing this a very long time. It's the first time that it has happened, and I hope that it is the last time. The interruption of normal programs, I hope, is not a harbinger of things to come. The Queen is poorly, maybe very poorly. They may be keeping from us just how poorly the 95-year-old monarch actually is. There are many, many reasons, hundreds of them, to wish a speedy and full recovery to Her Majesty the Queen. Long life to her. There are many hundreds of reasons. A woman who has given extraordinary public service, whether you're a monarchist or, like me, a Republican, one has to concede that. But one of the reasons why we must hope that Her Majesty manages to plough on is that if she does not, we will instantly, in an instant, have a new monarch. The increasingly insufferable Prince Charles will now become our king. And that's going to be bad news for Britain. Bad news, I think, for the royal family also in the system of monarchy. Bad news for politics in Britain, because as we saw again on the news today, this prince just can't keep his nose out of political matters. He's learned nothing in his long years, decades of playing second fiddle to his mother about staying out of controversial political matters. But when his interventions stink of hypocrisy to the extent of today's, I think it was yesterday, but reported today, when that hypocrisy reaches a level that one simply cannot stomach it, it makes you realize that if he becomes the king anytime soon, he's going to be simply insufferable. He's going to be unstoppable. Every political issue will be one that he seeks to seize the soapbox for, while expecting due deference and indeed a measure of reverence to his position in our unwillingness, perhaps, to respond as robustly as you can be sure we will respond here on the mother of all talk shows. I refer, of course, to him wading in to the environmental debate. We've had many people on. We'll have many other people on. My apologies to Kevin McKenna that we weren't able to take him because of my absence in the first hour of the show. But we will next Sunday return to the subject of COP. But Prince Charles flew a private jet to Berlin to lecture the governments, elected governments for the most part, of the G20 about the need to give up so much of our normal way of life in the interests of stopping what they call the runaway train of global warming. He flew in a private jet to give that lecture, which he could have given, as I'm doing to you now, via Zoom from a hotel room, in my case in Milton Keynes, a kind of Paris of England. If you've never been there, don't try. But Milton Keynes is perfectly capable of hosting a Zoom speech, as I'm giving to you now. But Prince Charles flew in a private jet to Berlin. Then he flew back to London in a private jet from Berlin. Then he flew in another private jet to Glasgow, presumably to deliver exactly the same kind of homily. In fact, you can't move at Glasgow Airport for private jets. And of course, Air Force One, which must burn enough carbon to light Greenland in floodlights, arrived with President Biden's cavalcade in Scotland yesterday. Do you know how many cars are in Joe Biden's cavalcade at the COP conference? The COP conference to discuss global warming. It's a cavalcade of 80 vehicles, plus helicopters, plus Air Force One. These hypocrites, I don't know whether to laugh or cry at them crying into their cucumber smoothies about global warming. I know there's 80 cars because Joe Biden had a cavalcade of 80 cars in the Vatican, the smallest state in the world. There can be no room for any other vehicle other than President Biden's cavalcade. Mind you, the cavalcade was the least of the Pope's problems, reportedly, because Joe Biden overstayed his welcome with His Holiness. In fact, by double the time, Joe Biden extended his meeting with His Holiness, not just with a cockamamie joke, which couldn't have been funny even when Ronald Reagan uttered it in his senility, and sure was lost on the Argentine Pope when translated into Italian. It was a joke which, punchline of which was, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? You'd be 65, he said to the Pope, and I'd be 60. Side-splitting stuff, but nothing to what was going on afterwards in the Pope's lavatory. I don't want to get too gruesome, so let me just say that we now have it on the highest authority that the President of the United States had a toilet accident in the Vatican. Holy shit. It's almost too excruciating to adumbrate. But it's true. The leader of what they laughingly call the free world can't control his own bowels. He can't control what comes out of his mouth. And now we know he can't control what comes out of his ass. It must have been excruciating for His Holiness to be told that this toilet accident had occurred, especially if he then contemplated that this man's finger is on the nuclear button. This man is openly threatening China with war. This man is openly threatening Russia with war, Iran with war, Cuba with war, Venezuela with war, and he can't control his own bowel movements. For how long are the American people going to put up with this extreme humiliation? How long are the American people going to be required to suffer the ever-increasing embarrassment that is President Joe Biden? Now, of course, the hypocrites are all there. In rat-infested Glasgow, the worst run city in the worst run part of the United Kingdom, with little nationalist go-lighters running around promising native peoples everywhere their full support when they can't even collect their own dustbins. At midnight tonight, a dustbin strike starts in the city of Glasgow, a city that's deep in my heart, that I represented in Parliament for nearly 2 decades. Rats are the problem. The bin men just won't put up with them anymore. Not for the money they're getting paid. Why should they risk Wales disease, rats leaping out of overflowing bins? Oh no. And the railway workers, they're on strike too. So good luck if you make it to Scotland. Don't imagine you're going to be catching a train or that you're going to see a single bin being emptied. We'll talk at length next week. We'll get Kevin McKenna back, if he will, to deep dive into what happened at the Hypocrites Convention of the COP conference in Glasgow. Now, my next guest is a very, very good friend of mine, and he's here to talk about 2 important issues, not least because nobody else will talk about them. The first is the anniversary of the overthrow of the greatest of all African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, may God rest his soul. Patrice Lumumba, young, gifted and black, with vision, with a dedication to making what should be the richest country in Africa, the fairest and most just country in Africa, to make it a treasure trove for the peoples of Africa, to make it an armory for the liberation movements seeking to liberate what was then the rest of colonial occupied Africa. Patrice Lumumba was murdered by Belgian colonialism, by American colonialism, and not least by British colonialism. And another matter. I wrote a piece for RT.com just the other day about the discovery under the release of government papers, which takes place every year, but 50 years too late, 30 years too late sometime, which showed the centrality of the British government in the overthrow of the Indonesian independence leader, President Sukarno, who made Indonesia big in the world, where now it is small, who founded the non-aligned movement, whose Bandung conference in that jewel of the Orient, the great city of Bandung, to which all the great figures of the non-aligned movement, of the progressive parts of the world attended in the 1950s. He was brutally overthrown, and wait for this number, as many as 3 million of his supporters were murdered in cold blood by the military led by General Suharto, who went on to spend decades in power as the greatest thief in the world, rivaling his African counterpart, Mobutu Sese Seko, who of course helped in the murder of Patrice Lumumba. The Killing Season is a book that my good wife, who is Indonesian, is reading right now by Jeffrey B. Robinson. The Killing Season is a book that moved her to tears on the train coming down this afternoon. Vijay Prashad is an erudite author, commentator, and activist. But just before I interview him, let me give you this breaking news that 2 trains have crashed between Andover and Salisbury in Wiltshire in the United Kingdom. Somber news indeed. We'll bring you more of it when we can. Let me take a 1-minute break, and then my friend Vijay Prashad.
Radio Sputnik.
Peter says the Afghan people have lost, George. I thought you were better than this, to be honest. Give me a call, Peter. Tell me what you mean. And Oliver says, for some reason, George was on the jihadist side when it came to Yugoslavia. And that's the reason I will never trust him. I fought against the war on Yugoslavia with all my breath and all my heart. Me and Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and others were practically the only people in this country opposing the war on Yugoslavia, the destruction of Yugoslavia. How dare you, you imbecile? If you have any guts, you'll pick up the phone right now and call this show and justify that utter slander. Really. And Yoda says, love the show, best entertainment and education on the airwaves.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Vijay Prashad is a tri-continental man. I never know which continent I'm going to find him on, and I don't know tonight either which continent he's on. That's because he is an intellectual colossus in the movement for liberation and for justice in the world. And wherever there is injustice, you'll find his pen and his magnificent brain analyzing it. I hope he's there now, wherever he is. Vijay, thank you very much for joining me. Where do I find you this evening?
Well, I'm on my way, George, and it's great to be with you. I'm on my way to Glasgow. So I don't know which train I'm going to take, and I'm very sorry to hear about those train accidents and the downed lines and so on. But I hesitate, but yet I shall say it, this might have something to do with the privatization of rail in the United Kingdom. Typically, when one sees this happen, there's underfunding of infrastructure and so on, and it leads to a loss of life. But I'll be with you in Glasgow very soon.
Well, God willing, and I hope you survive the infestation of rats that I spoke about earlier. There's some two-legged rats going to be there also, Vijay, so keep your eyes open for them. And watch you don't get run over by Joe Biden's 80-car cavalcade. And, of course, don't go in the lavatory right after him. Now, Vijay, serious matters. Do you agree with my analysis that Patrice Lumumba was the greatest of all African leaders, or certainly would have become so if imperialism had not overthrown him?
You see, George, the continent of Africa has never been given a chance in the modern period to set its own clock to its own time. Sovereignty has been denied to that continent. Let's go before Patrice Lumumba. The real originator of the independence and sovereignty of Africa were the people of Ghana. Leading them, of course, was Kwame Nkrumah, another leader, close friend of Patrice Lumumba. In fact, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo considered Kwame Nkrumah as his mentor, as his leader. Nkrumah was overthrown in a bloody coup in Ghana. Of course, the coup against Lumumba was terrible. This is, as you said, one of the most important, significant countries on the continent of Africa. And then three and a half decades later, our very great leader, Thomas Sankara, picks up the mantle from Kwame Nkrumah, picks up the mantle from Patrice Lumumba. You know, Mr. Sankara led a country which was called Upper Volta, and he decided that as part of the ability to produce dignity among his people. He changed the name of Upper Volta, a ridiculous colonial name. He changed it to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. In a way, Patrice Lumumba was trying to create a land of upright people, and they were not allowed. He was murdered not only by the Congolese elites and others who didn't like him, but specifically by the Belgians, Belgian colonialism, assisted by the US colonials and by the British intelligence services. There's a very significant British intelligence officer, Daphne Park. She said later in her life that, yes, we were involved. We helped do it. It's a crime against humanity, because ever since then, George, Congo has never been able to stand up to be what it could be. In other words, the heart, central focus of Africa. The West did 3 coups, George, in 3 different countries around the same time to cut down the ability of these continents to rise up. The coup against Congo in 1961, the coup against Brazil in 1964, and the coup against Indonesia in 1965. Each of the main continents of the global South faced a major coup d'etat led by the West to prevent these continents, not only these countries, from standing up against imperialism.
And not to mention the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran not many years before that. It's trite almost. It was that these leaders could not be trusted to govern their countries in the interests of the powerful Western countries. Isn't that so?
Let's stay with the Congo for a minute, George, because people don't talk about what was at the heart of this. Do you know that the Congo was seen as the principal producer of what the CIA called industrial diamonds? Industrial diamonds, George, is a code word for uranium. The uranium used in the 2 atom bombs that were exploded at Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Congo, from one particular mine in the Congo. Right up to the late 1960s, the West, particularly the United States, worried deeply that if they didn't secure Congolese uranium, then the Soviets would get their hands on it. The Congo produced some of the highest grade of uranium. There was a real problem in the US government because they pledged to buy uranium from Canada, but if they actually took the Canadian offer at hand, they'd have to neglect buying the Congolese uranium. They didn't want to do that. They wanted control of all uranium sources. And until the Congo won its independence in 1960-61, the uranium that arrived in the United States was invoiced as Belgian uranium. Belgium doesn't have any uranium. It's like talking about Brazzaville's diamonds. There are no diamonds in Brazzaville. That was diamonds from the Congo that used to be smuggled in collusion with the French into Brazzaville across the river from what was then Leopoldsville and would be sold as Brazzaville diamonds. No, there is no Belgian uranium. It was from the Congo. And it was uranium that just fixed the mind of the CIA, fixed the mind of British intelligence. They just didn't want the Soviets to get involved with being able to access, not only control, but access the uranium from the Congo. It was uranium in the Congo. It was oil in Brazil. João Goulart, who was overthrown in the coup in 1964, was moving ahead to nationalize the oil. What the United States and British intelligence just didn't want to see happen in Brazil was for this very large country, the largest country in South America, to provide an example to other countries that you could nationalize key sectors of the economy. Kwame Nkrumah was doing something unforgivable. He refused to merely produce cacao, the raw material for chocolate. He refused. He said, Ghana will not forever be producing the raw material for chocolate. We want to advance. We want to create aluminum, not just sell bauxite. We want to process our own goods. We want to industrialize. All of that is unacceptable. And I must say, when you read the record in the CIA archive, you get the most racist kind of language talking about how these people are still in the trees, they can't be seen to walk on the land and so on. You get a British intelligence officer, P.B. Whitstanley, writing about Brazil, saying, well, their development can only go so far as their mulattoes can handle. This is the racist colonial attitude, but it's rooted, George, in the fact that there are precious raw materials that the West thought was their patrimony. Nobody else could access it.
And of course, in the case of Congo, they had to, it was not credible to go back to Belgian direct rule. So they had to find a credible patsy to pretend to be the decision maker, the president. And they found the army officer, Mobutu Sese Seko, who went on actually to perhaps be the biggest thief of the 20th century. He stole literally billions of dollars from this exceedingly rich country of the Congo. How did he manage to stay in power so long, Vijay?
Well, Mobutu, or Joseph Mobutu as he was before, was a very smart man because he insinuated himself in the 1950s into the ranks both of Belgian intelligence and of the CIA. And on top of all that, George, he was a very close personal advisor to Lumumba. Lumumba trusted him. At one point when Lumumba became prime minister, Mobutu was removed from control of the army and he complained, and Lumumba in a very teary moment brought him back in. I mean, one of the problem with people like Lumumba and so on is we are softies, we are sentimentalists. People of the left are sentimentalists.
Not me, Vijay. Not me.
Not you. Well, maybe not you, George, but there's too many examples of this that we see. Mobutu comes to power eventually after Lumumba is captured and then brutally murdered. I mean, his body is dissolved in acid and so on. The first strategy with the Congo was to break the Congo up with a series of secession movements in Katanga and South Kasai and so on. That was not necessary once Lumumba was overthrown. Mobutu arrives as the strong man in the same way as Suharto was the strong man in Indonesia, and the Western intelligence services fully backed them. British intelligence, George, plays a key role in all of these because what British intelligence does, and let me just be very frank with you, what the British Broadcasting Corporation does, the BBC, is it provides a kind of intellectual cover for these dictatorships. The BBC has a long history of collaborating one way or the other with British intelligence to basically do an information operation, and kind of psych ops to say, well, actually, there was Lumumba was getting too close to the Soviets, so he was doing his own coup. Or in Indonesia, they accused the left, the communist left, of attempting a coup and therefore and trying to go after the military and justifying the military crackdown, including the murder of millions of communists. There was, as I said, a British intelligence involvement in Indonesia in that coup of 1965. The British were very worried that the government of Mr. Sukarno was going to challenge British base in Singapore. You see, the British relied on Singapore. Singapore and Malaysia had just divided. Lee Kuan Yew became the premier of Singapore. A very large part of Singapore's governance was dominated by the British Foreign Office. There was a base there. The British saw the Straits of Malacca essentially as their sea. And Indonesia was going to challenge this. So from Singapore, there was a British, intelligence base set up. Mr. Wynne was the British intelligence officer, and they were producing these newsletters in the build-up to the coup, which were basically filled with false information about what the communists were threatening to do. And they built up support among the Australians. The Australians played a key role in the coup and murder in Indonesia in 1965. The Australians were faxing in the old days of, actually, I think they may have been telex machines. They were sending by telex lists of names of people that should be eliminated. In fact, Jeffrey Robinson, whose book you just showed, had a previous book on Bali, the paradise of Bali. That book was called The Other Side of Paradise, in which Robinson details how information was coming from Western intelligence services, quite granular detail of which people to pick up and who to kill. We haven't really, I think, as a planet, come to terms with what these coups, the coup in Congo, the coup in Brazil, and the coup in Indonesia meant. We haven't really come to terms, George.
Well, the better for hearing from you tonight about it, and let's hope it encourages wider reading on these matters. Good luck on your journey to Glasgow. Stay safe. Vijay Prashad, thank you for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Now we've got a poll running. Would you support a tax on meat to help the environment? A mighty 17% of you say yes. 83% of you say no. You can vote now on my Twitter feed, on YouTube, and on my Telegram channel. Let's take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik.
Downloads of the podcast, huge numbers are downloading this week's highlights in the UK and in the US, but also in countries like Japan, India, Denmark, Saudi Arabia. You probably get executed for that. Korea, Switzerland, the UAE, and Hong Kong in China. Thank you for all the great reviews you've been leaving on Apple Podcasts, and including this one. In British politics, Mr. Galloway stands as the last bastion of sense. Like a fine wine, he gets better with age. I have been a fan of his since 2002. I would recommend anyone to listen to him. The best podcast around. Thank you very much indeed. That was touching testimony. Thank you so much. If you do listen, give a 5-star review. Why don't you?
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the recorders to talk about that. Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
We're watching the mother of all talk shows, coming to you from a hotel room in Milton Keynes. Surreal doesn't even begin to cover the day that I have had. But nonetheless, the show must go on, even in these straitened circumstances. Let me tell you further about the train crash. It's coming out of Wiltshire, United Kingdom tonight. Further information reaches us that the incident involved 2 trains. It's being reported that they collided inside a tunnel. Almost impossible to imagine. One of the trains involved was the 1720 Great Western service out of London Waterloo to Honiton in Devon. The incident happened at the Fisherton Tunnel on the outskirts of Salisbury. It's believed that the collision happened near Greatley between Andover and Salisbury. Emergency services, God bless them, from Dorset and Wiltshire Fire and Rescue Services are on the scene with 50 firefighters and sadly a number of ambulances. No word on casualties yet. The poll's still running. Would you support a tax on meat to help the environment? You can vote on my Twitter, on my Telegram, and on my YouTube. Let's take a call. I hope we can, from Robert in Dunfermline. Go ahead, Robert.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Mentioning Salisbury, I went to school in Salisbury, so my heart's going out to any possible victims there.
Sounds utterly horrific, I must say.
Well, the subject I was calling about was this monarchy versus republicanism.
Yeah.
Now, you're a Republican.
Yeah.
But earlier on, you were putting the monarchy down, not personally as in the Queen, but the monarchy generally. But you did get a bit personal with Charles. The stuff you said about Charles, I think I agree with.
I think a lot of people agree with me, Robert.
Yeah, he is seen as a bit, sort of not fit for purpose.
But odd.
But he could surprise us. Now,
well, isn't the real problem, Robert, that we have to put up with him whether he surprises us or not? He is the head of state, whether we like it or not, or whether he's a complete disaster or not. He'll remain the head of state. Isn't that a little, childish, Robert?
I don't think it's childish when you compare it to the scandalous election of presidents, for instance, in America.
Oh, yeah, I'm not proposing an executive president. I mean, I believe when Her Majesty passes, long life to her, I hope she fully recovers for, as I said earlier, hundreds of reasons. But after her demise, and all things must pass, it's time for a referendum in Britain on whether to continue this system of monarchy or not. That's my view.
So you would advocate going down the same line as the United States? Whereby
Absolutely not. Sorry, I thought I just said that. I'm not advocating an executive presidency at all. I think that would be wholly deleterious. That would be out of the frying pan into the fire. I'm talking about a ceremonial president, a president for state occasions, not for politics. He needn't even be an elected president, at least not directly elected. In Ireland, I think the president is elected. I'm not even proposing that, although I could be persuaded. I think Parliament should pick the president, and that president should have purely state functions, not executive functions at all. No, I believe in a parliamentary democracy.
Where would the power lie? It's got to lie with...
Has to lie with the Parliament.
With the House of Lords?
Oliver Cromwell bathed the country in blood to establish the primacy of Parliament, and the rest is just a fiction.
And what about the House of Lords?
Oh, I'd abolished that long ago. I'd have abolished that half a century or a century ago.
Despite the fact that in fairly recent times they've gone against the government and with the will of the people.
Well, when was that, and how often has that been?
Well, not very often, I've got to say.
No, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you, the death warrant for me, Robert, was when the putrefying corpses of the British aristocracy were dragged off the grouse moors into the voting lobbies in the House of Lords to ram through the poll tax, to ram through Mrs. Thatcher's poll tax, which made the Duke pay the same tax as the person that emptied the Duke's dustbin. That was the very, very end for the House of Lords for me.
Did the Duke's dustbin have rats in it?
Well, if it was in Glasgow, almost certainly. Robert, thanks for the call. Very nice to hear from you. Let's go to Victor in Birkenhead on COP26. Go ahead, Vic.
Hello, George. I want to tell you, and the whole world, the main cause of global warming and acid rain is hydrofluoric acid, which is the cheapest way of making petrol. And you might recall in the early 1980s, all you heard on the news is acid rain, acid rain, acid rain. And then in 1986, on May the 8th, in the Times newspaper, which I used to read before Rupert Murdoch ruined it, Professor Terry Mansfield from Lancaster University and John Newall wrote that exhaust from motor cars and refinery flare stacks was the cause of acid rain. I immediately wrote to Professor Mansfield, who replied that his research was now being paid for by ESSO, and that we should be more concerned about other toxins that occur in the environment. Should ESSO, where I have also worked, on their Fawley refinery, have shown Mr. Mansfield how they make petrol, they did not use hydrofluoric acid for making up till 1990. I don't know what they do there now. And anyway, that's what happens with the hydrofluoric acid. Is it burns away the ozone layer and lets the sun's infrared rays through. And
well, everyone's an expert on these things, as on COVID and all the rest of it. I promise you a full dress debate next week, Vic, on global. I promise you a full dress debate next week on global warming, COP26, and so on. Many thanks for the call. Let's hear from Abdi in Minnesota on Patrice Lumumba. Go ahead, Abdi.
Assalamu alaikum, George. How are you today?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah barakatuh. Go ahead.
Hey, I actually wanted to piggyback on our idea from last week, but I just had a beautiful piece on Africa, and I wanted, actually, it was one of my plans today to ask you to do a show about Africa sometime soon, but you beat me to it.
No, we only had a small part. We will have to do more on it, and I think Vijay is the man to lead it, don't you? I think his analysis is brilliantly eloquent and clear.
Most definitely. It was the first time I heard about Vijay, and I learned a lot just listening to him.
He's the top man. If I was the president, he'd be my foreign secretary for sure. Now, what do you want to say about Lumumba, Abdi?
I wanted to say, I wish, as an Africanist or from the African continent, I wish we had carried away with his idea of United States of Africa.
Yeah.
Every time that those names come up, always that the colonialists and their cutting the legs of the African leaders just shows up from the background for some reason. And honestly, to be honest with you, a great example is the man from Burkina Faso that you guys have mentioned it. Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara
didn't have long. He didn't have long, but in the time that he had, he showed that he could have built a land of upright people.
Exactly. What he did was that country he uplifted. Up until today, there are brothers that visit his grave every day. Every day they visit his grave, Thomas Sankara.
Now,
just understanding how he was important to them.
Funnily enough, he was murdered by his friend. They were in a rock and roll band together. Kampori murdered Lumumba.
Exactly.
Just as Kampori murdered Sankara, just as Mbuto murdered
Lumumba.
Just
exactly.
As Zia murdered Mr. Bhutto, just as Pinochet murdered President Allende. You see a pattern here of foolish, sentimental weaknesses, of not ruthlessly policing the police.
Exactly. And that brings to my mind what the great Bob Marley said. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look?
It's a very, very powerful line, that from a very, very powerful song. Abdi, I promise we'll dive deeper into Africa in the next few weeks. Now, Jamie Blackett says, to save the planet, we should be eating more grass-fed meat, not less. Well, Jamie is my principal advisor on agricultural matters, so I have to concur. Hell's Bell says, no, I don't support a tax on meat, and I'm a vegetarian. It would take us back to medieval times. when poor people ate nothing but turnips. Very, very good indeed. You see, this is one of the problems with this global warming lark. It all implies making the poor poorer and making the poor countries less developed, stopping the development of the poor countries and making the working people in the developed countries pay more, eat less, have less. This frenetic attempt to persuade us that growth is bad, when in fact it's only growth that can lift our people out of poverty and lift the poor world out of poverty. Orion is in Oakland. Didn't I clash with him last week? On you go, Orion. Welcome back.
Thanks, brother. Yeah, long live the international working class. I'm telling you, Vijay was so great. I never heard him. I'm 77 years old, and I'm totally ignorant of so many things that you know about. And I thank you so much for bringing all this to me and my friends. I'm trying to get it out to everybody.
Thank you, brother.
Hopefully 1 million people, maybe 10 million, I wanted to continue with this thing that divides the working class, because I know you're for the working class and I'm for the working class, so we have to figure that out, right? I wanted to ask you a question. The Euros, you had the Euros, and there was racist attacks against the Italians. Now, who attacked the racist? Who were the racists that attacked the Italian spectators that were watching the Euros?
I don't know about that. What I do know is there was a torrential abuse on social media, which is not the same thing as attacks. We should be careful, keep in perspective what an attack is and what a disgusting tweet is. Against England's black players that missed the penalties. Although when analysed, most of those vicious, racist tweets and other social media comments, Instagram was particularly vile, came from outside of the United Kingdom, came from other countries. So look, there's racism everywhere, Orion, in every country, and there's racism amongst every race. There are some black people that look down on people that are blacker than them. There are black people attacking Asian people on the streets of San Francisco. There are Arab people that wouldn't dream of letting their daughter marry a black person, even though the Prophet Muhammad picked and freed a slave, Bilal, and gave him one of the most important roles in Islam. Muslims like to tell you that they're not racist, but if you're a black man, try asking a Saudi Arabian if you can marry his daughter. So look, man, there's racism everywhere. We have to fight it. I hope you don't misunderstand my stance. We have to fight it, but we have to fight it with a positive program to unite all the working people of the land, of other lands, of the world, because if we allow race or religion or sexual orientation or gender to loom like an Everest on the public landscape, then all we're doing is weakening the working class and weakening black as well as white working class people, gay as well as straight working class people, trans as well as men and women, born men and women, working class. We're dividing our forces when in fact we really need to unite. That's the difference between me and the identity politicians. Jamie Lowe now with the news.
Radio Sputnik News.
The leaders of the world's richest economies have agreed to pursue efforts to limit global warming with meaningful and effective actions. Exactly how this will be achieved was not revealed in the leaders' communique at the G20 summit in Rome. Host nation Italy had hoped that firm targets would be set before the COP26 summit in Glasgow, which began today. The G20 group, made up of 19 countries and the European Union, accounts for 80% of the world's emissions. The communique also makes no reference to achieving net zero by 2050, which many countries have already pledged to do, and climate scientists say is critical to avoid a climate catastrophe. The communique does pledge, however, to stop financing new unabated coal plants internationally by the end of this year. A strong message to coal-reliant nations such as China, Russia and India. But the G20 leaders stopped short of agreeing to end coal power in their own nation. Malawi's president had a strong message to the rich developed nations that are yet to meet a promise to pay £100 billion to poorer countries each year to deal with climate change. Quote, "It's not a charity act, so pay up or perish with us," Lazarus Chakwera told BBC Africa. As long ago as 2009, the developed world pledged that it would mobilise that sum by 2020 to help less developed countries deal with the effects of climate change and build greener economies. But this target has still not been achieved, and the UK government, which is hosting this summit, now says it's unlikely to be until 2023. Many travellers to COP26 in Glasgow chose to make the journey by rail as a more environmentally friendly option, but hundreds were left at London's Euston Station due to cancelled trains. A tree which fell in strong winds damaged overhead wires in Northamptonshire, meaning all trains are suspended, including Avanti West Coast trains to Glasgow. Another fallen tree in Peterborough caused delays to LNER trains to Scotland from King's Cross, but the company says the line has now reopened with some delays expected until the end of the day. Environmental campaigner Greta Thunberg has defended the tactics of activists who have blocked roads, saying, quote, "Sometimes you need to anger people." Thunberg, who is in Glasgow for the COP26 summit, told the BBC it was important to ensure no one was hurt. It comes after Insulate Britain protesters have repeatedly brought major roads to a standstill. The 18-year-old activist was surrounded by police, media and supporters when she arrived for the climate change summit in Glasgow by train on Saturday evening. It's up to France to solve the ongoing fishing row with the UK by stepping back from threats over access to ports, the UK government has said. Prime Minister Boris Johnson met the French President Emmanuel Macron today to discuss continuing tensions around permits for French fishing boats. French officials said the pair had agreed to work together in the next hours and days on a solution. But later, a spokesperson for Johnson said no measures had been agreed. Instead, the official statement on behalf of the Prime Minister said he had, quote, reiterated his deep concern over the rhetoric emanating from the French government in recent days, including the suggestion by the French Prime Minister that the UK should be punished for leaving the EU. And it said the Prime Minister had expressed his hope that the French government would de-escalate this rhetoric and withdraw their threats. The PM spokesperson then went further, adding, "It's down to France to decide if they want to step away from the deeply concerning threats. We are not seeking to escalate this. We would welcome if they de-escalate and withdraw the threats they have made. It will be for the French to decide," said the statement. Actor Alec Baldwin has spoken publicly for the first time since the accidental fatal shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of a Western film Rust, calling it a 1 in a trillion episode. The actor and his wife Hilaria stopped to speak to reporters on a roadside in Vermont, and while Baldwin said he could not comment on the ongoing investigation, he said that Hutchins was, quote, "my friend." Gunmen who identified themselves as Taliban attacked a wedding in eastern Afghanistan to stop music being played, killing at least 2 people and injuring 10 others, officials say. A Taliban spokesperson said 2 of the 3 gunmen had been arrested but denied they had acted on behalf of the Islamist movement. Music was banned when the Taliban ruled the country from 1996 to 2001. The new authorities have not yet issued such a decree. An eyewitness said that 4 couples were being married in a joint wedding in a province of Nangarhar on Friday. They had taken permission from a local Taliban leader to play recorded music in an area used only by women. But late at night, the gunmen forced their way inside and tried to smash the loudspeakers. When the guests protested, the armed men opened fire. More than 160 buildings in a Myanmar town have been destroyed in fires caused by shelling from government troops. According to local media, tensions between Myanmar's military junta and opposing militia forces have continued to grow since the army seized power from the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi in February. Now footage has emerged showing burning buildings in an area located in the northwestern Chin state, with flames and thick billowing smoke rising into the air. A man has died after being gored at a bull-running festival in Spain, authorities said. The 55-year-old was repeatedly attacked by the animal at the event in Onda in eastern Spain on Saturday, according to the town's council. He suffered a wound to his left leg and a head wound and bled to death from his injuries, according to emergency services. At least 9 people have been killed in a car bombing near an airport in Yemen's temporary capital, Aden. Another 12 people are believed to have been injured in Saturday's explosion, described as a terrorist bombing by Prime Minister Muin Abdulmak Saeed. Eyewitnesses say women and children are among the casualties. So far, no one has claimed responsibility. The country's internationally recognised government has been based in Aden since 2014, when the Houthi rebels forced them from the capital, Sana'a. The fighting has reportedly left more than 110,000 people dead, triggered the world's worst humanitarian disaster with millions on the brink of famine, and left the country even more vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, a sealed Super Mario Bros. 2 video game from 1988, found at the back of a walk-in cupboard in the US state of Indiana, has sold for more than $88,000, according to the auction house handling the sale. It said the item was found in near-mint condition in a box of video games in the crowded cupboard, which was part of a deceased estate in Floyd Knobs, Indiana. At an online auction last week, the item sold for $88,550, including the buyer's premium. Games from Super Mario, a series first released in 1985, have been fetching record-breaking prices in the past couple of years. In July, a copy of Super Mario 64 sold for over $1.5 million, the most ever paid for a video game. It broke the record set at the same auction for another Nintendo game, The Legend of Zelda, which fetched $870,000. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
You are watching the most unusual mother of all talk shows of all time, brought to you from a hotel room in Milton Keynes. Have you seen Milton Keynes? It is a veritable Paris, at least after the nightmare journey of 7.5, nearly 8 hours on a train, which terminated well short of London, which is why I'm not in the studio, so apologies for any diminution of quality, but we've still got the very best of guests. But before I go to our next guest, what did you think about ABBA's digital concert? Personally, I thought they were in, I don't know, an eventide home. I thought they were well over the hill, but apparently they're still treading the boards. Well, if the Rolling Stones can do it, I suppose ABBA can do it also. But they've got a digital concert going on. So what did you think? Here's the next quiz, the next poll. How do you feel about ABBA's digital concert? Money, 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 it's a rich man's world. That's A, it's a rich man's world. Or, gimme, gimme, gimme. I think I better stop singing. My wife is looking at me angrily. But you can vote on my Twitter, on my Telegram, and on my YouTube. Now, Garland Nixon is the very best independent political analyst in the United States. And how lucky are we that at absolutely no expense, he agrees to join me so often here on the mother of all talk shows. Garland Nixon, welcome back I hope that didn't surprise you, that it's absolutely no expense. I hope the agent didn't promise you.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope to get you at absolutely no expense on my radio show in Los Angeles soon.
Absolutely. That's a rain check, as you say in the United States. Now, your president's over here, Garland. We used to say in the days leading up to D-Day that the problem with the Americans was that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Well, now you're all over here, including the president, who had an unfortunate time, to say the least, with the Pope in the Vatican, and has arrived here with his 80-car cavalcade for an environmental conference to denounce fossil fuels and demand state and also personal action on that. Without going into the dirty details, it's getting to the stage where President Biden is an embarrassing elderly relative now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And he's probably far better being away from the United States right now. If you look at the approval numbers for President Biden right now, yes, he's mumbling incoherently, but I think after 9 months, people are pretty much accustomed to that. However, when we look at the numbers, 71% of Americans feel that the country's heading in the wrong direction, including 48% of the people in his own party, the Democratic Party. We've got his approval ratings have dropped 11%. His disapproval ratings has increased 15%. And the Democrats are looking at a couple of elections in traditionally blue states, which would be Virginia and New Jersey here in 2 days. So there is a great fear in Democratic Party land that 9 months and 10 days into the Biden administration, things are not looking well for the future.
Now, these are real blue-collar states. What kind of elections are they? For what?
Okay, so there's a number, of course, the most important is the gubernatorial election, which would be the governor of the state. In Virginia, particularly, Virginia is a blue state, very traditionally blue state. It was a southern red state. However, a lot of people moving out of the metropolitan areas into northern Virginia has turned it blue for quite a while. It's been a decade since the Republicans had a lot of power in Virginia. However, Kamala Harris is there. The Democratic Party is not feeling very good about their chances, even though the numbers say that they're tied. And they're actually running a guy named Terry McAuliffe. He is a Clinton acolyte, very wealthy man, and he has the charisma of a bag of ice. The interesting issue here is Donald Trump. The Republican candidate has been careful to, utilize the popularity of Donald Trump in that state without bringing Donald Trump in, because the Democrats have been pushing, this guy's a Trumpster. But within the last several days, I think they've recognized that it hasn't moved the poll numbers whatsoever, and they're trying to adjust more so to policy. If I had to predict, I would say the Democrats will likely lose Virginia. I would say they have an 11-point lead in New Jersey. If they lose New Jersey, they're in a whole lot of trouble. But right now, I'm thinking they're going to lose Virginia, and things are going in the wrong direction. Keep in mind, we're only 9 months into the Biden administration, and it's very poor timing for the Democrats, because Biden's signature legislation, he calls it Build Back Better, I call it the Billionaires Back Better legislation, is being, I'll put it like this, they're saying it's failing, I say it's being exposed as a fraud. They put forth social programs and things that would be very welcomed by the base of their party, and quickly cut them all out and bare bones it down to something that the Republicans would be happy with, which was probably the plan in the beginning.
Well, the U.S. media was very clear about it this week, that business has triumphed in the debates around the bill that Biden once floated as being a panacea for America's ills, with something in it for everybody, but the rest have all been thrown overboard, haven't they? In this stimulus package, it's for business, but the working class, the middle class, has been completely devastated, ignored, kicked overboard, not wanted on voyage.
Yeah, and part of the discussion, this has also brought up the discussion of the military-industrial complex. One of the things that has been floating around in the discussion in America is the fact that the United States Congress actually gave the military-industrial complex $25 billion more than they asked for. They came up with a particular number. Joe Biden said, "Great, I'll take that number," and the U.S. Congress says, "Oh no, you won't. You're not getting out of here without taking another $25 billion." Meanwhile, some of Joe Biden's signature legislations and definite campaign promises, such as free community college, which only cost $9 billion, was cut out. I think the mainstream media tried to make it a war of personalities. They came up with two names, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, and tried to argue that these people were commandeering the legislation. But I don't think a lot of Americans bought the idea that a freshman senator who chairs no committees, who has no power, who's been in 2 years in power, is more powerful than the president of the United States. I think most people realize that this was a stalking horse operation, and that Joe Biden is certainly on the side of those who bare bones this legislation down into, just more money for corporations and nothing for the working class and those who put him in office.
Yeah, I mean, these recalcitrant senators were pushing at an open door. As you say, this was probably the intention all along. And yet, the much vaunted squad, the awkward leftish, in a kind of fashionista sense at least, that came on to the scene over the last few years, got elected over the last couple of years, they're going along with it, aren't they?
Yeah, and the squad, initially they were very popular in America amongst the left. That popularity is dramatically waning. People are realizing that the squad is good for a lot of strongly worded tweets. Wouldn't it be great if we had fill in the blank? And then they will vote for legislation that has none of the things that they've tweeted. It's the tweet squad. And if you want strongly worded tweets, you're going to get plenty of them. But when it comes to supporting empire worldwide, I mean, AOC follows Juan Guaido of all people. So I think the squad does not have a lot of support from the actual left in America. It's just the neoliberal synthetic left, as Caleb Hoffman, a term I often uses, still supports them, but they're of no value to actually supporting legislation that would help the poor, the working poor, and the working class.
In those circumstances, I mean, I used to say that the Democrats and the Republicans were two cheeks of the same backside, just like Labour and the Conservative Party here, two cheeks of the same ass. That's different now, or at least looks and sounds different because of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump may be no different to the rest of the political class. The point is, he looks different. He sounds different. And the political class are so desperate to stop him, people suspect that he might be different. That's a dilemma, isn't it, Garland?
Yes, it is, because the thing about Donald Trump is he's not a member of the technocratic class. The technocratic class that Joe Biden comes from argues that the system is fine. We just need a better system manager, and Joe Biden would be the better system manager. Donald Trump, not being a member of that class, can basically shoot from the hip. And on the odd occasion, Donald Trump will say something that the working class hears and says, yeah, I'm all for that. Yes. So Donald Trump can step outside of the establishment paradigm on the odd occasion. And basically what Donald Trump ends up with is a scenario where people look at him and they're like, well, Donald Trump's not much of an option, but they're worse. And that's how he wins. He doesn't have to do anything. They look worse than him. And every now and then he makes a humorous and very accurate statement attacking the machine, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, sometimes from, whatever direction he may happen to come from on a given day. And he has success. And I would say right now, if Donald Trump were to run against Joe Biden, he'd destroy him. I mean, let's face it, who wouldn't beat Joe Biden right now? He is not well respected, not just like he is not respected as a competent leader.
the Democrats and in the deep state, let's cut to the chase, are so desperate to stop Trump that something might happen. Something might happen to him, or some move might be made to try and legal him out of the next presidential election. A bit of lawfare might be mounted, perhaps around the issues of the so-called insurrection at the Capitol, which frankly was a boisterous demonstration in most people's countries. There were people killed, but they were almost all of them Trump supporters that were killed. But maybe around that issue, maybe around issues of familial corruption or tax, like they got Al Capone, they may try to keep him out of the election, which risks social disorder, civil disorder on a very large scale in the United States, as his supporters feel that they've been robbed, been cheated, and Trump leading them. I mean, that might make January 6th look like a tea party. Or they allow him to go in for the elections, in which case he wins. And this time it's no more Mr. Nice Guy. That's quite a problem for the ruling elite in the US, isn't it?
I agree. And let's be honest, it wouldn't be the first time the deep state and the machine, the neoliberal machine, attempted to use extra democratic means to preemptively coup Donald Trump or to get him out of office after he left. Recently, more and more information has been coming out about the infamous Russiagate hoax scandal. I guess hoax is the wrong term, really. It was an illegal coup operation. We're finding that it's getting closer and closer to Hillary Clinton. And the other, I think, important part about that is, and particularly in relation to this discussion, is it's getting less plausible that the FBI was misled. You know, they're trying to argue that they were misled by people, that they were given false information. They're trying to use the same argument that George Bush and his team used when they went into Iraq, that they were misled. It's getting harder and harder to make that argument. Recent information has come out that the FBI, when they got bad information about Donald Trump using a server or something, an Alpha Bank server, to communicate with the Russians, they immediately went over, they got a warrant, and they seized the server. However, when it came to the Democratic National Committee and their servers were allegedly infiltrated by the Russians, they didn't seize the server. They just asked a company that was quite friendly to the Democratic Party to tell them what was on the server. So it's getting harder to argue that the FBI and the intelligence agencies were not involved in the preemptive coup attempt in 2015, 2016, et cetera. And that being said, I would agree, if they tried and failed the last time, I would certainly expect that they would take a different angle. Who knows? Joseph Misfood has disappeared into ether. Maybe he'll pop up again. Maybe we'll find out who that guy is once and for all.
My next film is about that very coup, Garland. I hope to interview you for it. How the British stole an American presidency, and that's exactly what they did. Steal, and the Russiagate hoax were responsible. Not since the British burned the White House has a foreign country intervened so successfully in American politics. It wasn't the Russians that stole that presidency. It was the British. How about that, hundreds of years after George Washington? Garland Nixon, thank you for joining us, as always, on the mother of all talk shows. Let me take a quick 1-minute break.
Radio Sputnik.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story, in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got blood on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
And don't forget, you can get from Amazon the Killing Kelly DVD, and you can download it on Vimeo.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Now, very big thanks to all those that turned out in very inclement weather at Kingston last week for the showing of my latest film, Killing Kelly, about the strange death of Dr. David Kelly. It was a splendid evening, spirited question and answer session, and even some nice homemade cake from Grandma Giles. So thanks to everyone that was involved. There's one more scheduled of these showings. It's Monday, the 15th of November in the Crown Plaza Hotel in Manchester. But I warn you, when I came on air, there was only 9 tickets left. So literally it is the last few tickets. And we can't run it for a second night, and we can't get a bigger venue, I'm afraid. So there's the details. You can check now. I hope that before the end of the show, the last 9 of the tickets have gone. Now, we asked you about ABBA's digital concerts. How did you feel about them? 78% of you think it's pure greed. It's a rich man's world. Money, money, money. 22% of you, though, said, give me a ticket. I'll let you on a secret. My wife will definitely be wanting to buy a ticket. Now, MOATS, the podcast, is again a chart-topping 5-star hit all over the world. I'm not making this up. Listeners are loving the highlights of the mother of all talk shows. The people of Nigeria, Pakistan, Iceland, Slovakia, Mexico, and Singapore got the MOATS podcast into their top 10 charts this week. And that's not counting our listening community here on Sputnik Radio all over the world. If you're not yet listening, then please subscribe. You can take MOATS on the go with you. It's a distilled 19-minute version of the full show. Let's go to the phone lines. Hear from Kieran, who is in Glasgow. Go ahead, Kieran.
Good evening, George. A happy Halloween to you, my good friend.
Thank you very much.
Yes, give me a ticket for Patti Smith tonight at the Royal Concert Hall.
Now you're talking.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry to hear about your train experience. It sounds like a lost chapter from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Very well said. Indeed, it felt like it.
Yes. I would like to know if you're attending any of the events at COP26, George.
No, I'm not. No, my security is can't be guaranteed in Scotland, I'm afraid, Kieran. So I don't go out and about. That's why there's no showings of Killing Kelly. You may know that somebody's already been convicted of threatening to shoot me in the head, and someone else who denies the charge is up on trial next week. In fact, on Monday the 15th, for threatening the same. So, no, I'm not safe to be out and about in Scotland. It's a pity, but that's how it is.
Well, it's great to hear from you, George, anyway. You take care of yourself, my friend.
Thank you, Kieran. Good of you to say so. Anthony is in Detroit on the US budget. Let's hear from him. Anthony, welcome.
Hey, haunted Halloween to you, George. Well,
all this Halloween, this is an American thing, Anthony. You sent all this stuff over to us. We had a perfectly innocent Halloween tradition until the US exported this satanic ritual that it's become. Anyway, happy to you. On the way. On you go.
Okay, well, the tax on meat idea just really made me chuckle because it made me think of this quote-unquote infrastructure bill, which is also, as Garland said, kind of packed with some random social programs that we definitely need, but, depending on who you ask and which day of the week, it may or may not have those in it. But I was able to ask my congressperson on another radio program, how are you going to invest in a privately owned infrastructure? Because like our electric company, it's the company that has shareholders. And on top of that, they want us to subscribe, quote unquote, for greener energy and pay more in our bill each month to the company for, I don't know, so they can be greener. So I asked my congressperson, how are you going to invest in this? And she says, and she's one of the squad people. And she says, we're going to get more solar panels and make them fix the neglected areas. So I'm laughing at this bill, and then Canada wants to challenge. They have proposed tax credits for union-made USA electric vehicles, and in the bill, and Canada wants to challenge that under the USMCA, as well as 11 Republican governors for the union-made stipulation. So it's just hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, I was on like you on another show this week, and I was making the point, all this enmity against China stealing the American workers' lunch. It was actually the American capitalists that stole the workers' lunch and flew it to China so they could turn it into a bigger banquet for themselves. The fault for all these things lies at home. The main enemy is at home. This is something I've been preaching all my life, Anthony.
Yeah, and their solution seems like it's just to print $1 trillion coin, and we all know that goes to J.P. Morgan first. So it's so sad. And meanwhile, the only person Kamala Harris can get a laugh out of is herself. She was campaigning for the Virginia governor, dude. It's so funny.
Well, she may well get egg on her face, Anthony. Nobody likes a loser. Thanks for the call. Tarif is in New Orleans. Always a pleasure, Tarif. Go ahead.
Thanks for taking my call, Mr. Galloway. First, I'd like to say before I get to my comment, hashtag free Julian Assange, free Dong Zunzer, and hands off Haiti. Now, this dealing with the Assange case. This is what the journalists around the world have to do. Is obviously the deep state that's in Britain and also United States want to keep Julian Assange in the prison as long as possible. Basically, they want him to pass away to send a message to the world, So what the journalists have to do, whatever information they have to start releasing it on the deep state, because they got to show the deep state in the United States, the corrupt bureaucrats in Britain or whatever, that it's not only Julian Assange can release information, that they can release information too, because the thing is this: the deep state is not stupid. They know once Julian Assange is released, that he gonna go back releasing information again. So the deep state is actually in the catch-22. So it's damn if they do, damn if they don't. So the best thing is you got to start releasing information against them, exposing them for the crimes against humanity, what they did in Iraq, the United States, and throughout the world, dealing with different programs that they was doing regime changes. Those 600,000 people that the International Federation represent, they got to use them. They got to start sending out emails. They got to start sending out stories with hashtag Free Julian Assange every single day. You got to build up a momentum. The more they release these important classified documents, that's going to build support for Julian Assange. It just can't be one man releasing this information like Julian Assange. It got to be all of us. You see what I'm saying?
I sense, Tarif, that the tide has turned on the subject of Julian Assange. I think the heavy artillery of people like Amnesty International, International Federation of Journalists, and so on, and liberal grandees of all kinds who have been silent largely for the decade that this saga has been going on, has begun to tell. And I'll be surprised if the British appeal judges find for the Americans. I'm surprised that Joe Biden is persisting with it, because I take your point about damned if they do, damned if they don't. But the Democratic Party is ever more tarnished by its involvement in this sordid case, which has been corrupt and corrupted from the very beginning. The only thing I'd say is it's passing strange that the International Federation of Journalists are right behind hashtag Free Julian Assange, as are the British National Union of Journalists. And yet, virtually nothing appears on the mainstream media from those very journalists that are members of those unions and federations. And some of Julian's worst attempted assassins have, in fact, been journalists. After this quick break, it's my old parliamentary colleague, Conservative grandee, Stephen Norris. Stay tuned.
Radio Sputnik.
Here? Where am I?
Welcome to St. Peter's Gate, my son.
Is this one of that Hillary's tricks, that devil?
Be still, my son. The Clintons cannot hurt you here. You are safe with me in heaven.
Oh, heck. Knew I shouldn't have taken Bob's homemade vaccine. Oh, Lord have mercy, I am not worthy.
Before you pass on, you may ask any question you desire.
Anything?
With my omniscient knowledge, I can tell you anything you wish to know.
Well, Lord, you gotta tell me. All-powerful creator of this universe, before you judge me, I've been searching for answers my whole life.
Yes, my child.
I have to know. Who shot JFK?
Another one. It was a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was not a government agent, and there was no second shooter on that grassy knoll in Dallas.
My God! This goes higher up than we thought!
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
By the way, there was a former legend of ours, Damien from Brighton. He was a regular for many, many years, a very loyal follower of the show. We had a bit of a political falling out, but he was very good enough to come to the showing of Killing Kelly last week. Damien, your calls are always welcome. You might even get reinstated to legendary status. For the moment, the number one legend is Norma in Bristol, and she's up next. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I'm ever so glad you're back. I got quite nervous for you, really.
Yeah, we were a bit nervous too. There were pregnant women on board. There were claustrophobics on board. It was baking hot. There was no air, no windows. Doors were locked even when we were sitting at Northampton Station. The water had run out. You can't drink the water in the toilets. The toilets were beginning to, Bidenize. It was a nightmare, but nothing compared to what appears to have happened in Salisbury. So I shouldn't dwell on it. Norma,
I don't think there's been casualties, actually, from what
Really?
I've gathered. I know
let's pray that's the case.
Anyway, I haven't got much to say. It's just that money. I'm talking about big money. Did you realise George Bush? He's on a speaking tour of America at the moment, and each time he speaks, he gets paid £170,000.
Wow!
And that is true. That's what I've heard. I mean,
all I can say is that Tony Blair would be more expensive, and but then he can speak. I'm not sure what George Bush would do for that 170,000. I mean, what, swing from the trees? He's show us his colouring books.
Yeah, but George Bush, I know all the horrible things that happened. He did have a peculiar sense of humour. So perhaps not for all the money, but perhaps he would make people laugh.
Well,
I know he would make you laugh.
I would not. If I went to see him, I would try to arrest him. As a citizen's arrest, I would make an effort. And if I couldn't, I'd throw my shoes at him, as that young Iraqi journalist famously did. So they probably wouldn't let me anywhere near them. I once met Bill Clinton by infiltrating a reception line in Glasgow, funnily enough. And he looked at me and said, have we met before? I said, no, but you killed one of my friends in Iraq, the Arab world's greatest painter. Layla Al-Attar. So he was hurried away from me. So the same would be true if I went to see George Bush. But I must say the rehabilitation of George W. Bush amongst the liberal classes, the chatterati, the commentariat, is one of the most obscene phenomena of recent times. I must say, Norma.
Well, I just get so disillusioned. I mean, even our Chancellor of the Exchequer, he says, oh, well, we cannot, this is too expensive, that's too expensive. He's one of the richest men in our country. I think money, and it's absolutely over the top.
It's worth our Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'm going to talk to Steve Norris, I hope, before the end of the show, about him. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer is, in his own right, worth £300 million. But he married, well, as they say, Norma, he married the daughter of a multi-billionaire. So one can say that universal credit cuts are not going to touch the life of Rishi Sunak, Britain's finance minister, or Chancellor of the Exchequer. Am I right?
Well, yes, and I mean, this universal credit thing, even though he's done this paper thing, it's not going to give him very much more. I mean, probably £10 extra a week, and that's not as much as a packet of cigarettes.
Well, I wouldn't know. It's a filthy habit. Stop it. Thanks, Norma. Steve is in Leeds. Let's hear from Steve. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, Steve.
Hi there. I just want to say that I'm a big admirer of yours.
Thank you, sir.
And happy Halloween.
Thank you.
As well. I heard that Anthony...
I don't actually celebrate Halloween. In fact, I've forbidden my children to celebrate it. I think it's a satanic, dark event. But thanks for the spirit.
No, I live in Leeds and I was born in Coat Bridge, actually. So it's Halloween every day there. So.
I'll not hear a word said against Coat Bridge. It's one of my...
No, I love it. I love it, really.
A dear green place, a grotto to Christian civilization.
Well, it's where the best people, apart from, I think, maybe a couple of you politicians, have actually gone from. But anyway, I digress. I have a question about Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah.
So, I watched a couple of documentaries recently, and I heard that maybe you can obviously fill me in here, but I heard that there was a 9/11 connection with what Jamal Khashoggi actually knew with about what happened on 9/11, because there was links between what happened on 9/11, the people who were actually involved in it, to the Saudi royal family. And Jamal Khashoggi was very closely associated with that inner circle, even though he wasn't a part of it. That's the first question. I was just wondering...
well, let me deal with that one separately. Jamal Khashoggi, for those who don't know, was the Washington Post columnist, a resident of the United States, a friend of mine, whose hand I shook many times, whose cheek I kissed many times, who was murdered by Saudi Arabia in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and then cut into little pieces, and his remains flushed into the drains of Istanbul. I'm certain that Jamal, as a very well-informed man, knew a lot of the crimes of the Saudi royal family. I don't know anything specific about 9/11 in that regard, but it is a matter of historic record that the Saudi royal family had long supported Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and had long supported bountifully the fountainhead of the extremist Islamist school of thought that Al-Qaeda and later ISIS reflected. Quickly on your next question, Steve.
Sorry, yes. I was just going to ask another question about, well, it's about the Middle East. So why do we have to bother? Obviously, the United States, the UK, Canada, most of the world has its own resources to support themselves. Why do we have to rely on corrupt, murderous regimes when we don't really, apart from Israel and Palestine? I understand that. Why do we? What are we owing to them apart from fuel to a fire? Obviously, we don't want to be there for the rest of our lives.
Well, look, I'll tell you what, it's too late,
you know what I mean?
Too late in the night to go deeply into that, Steve.
I know.
Suffice to say this. As Nye Bevan once said, Britain is an island made of coal surrounded by fish. And it is quite a triumph of organization to run short of both. And that is exactly where we are now. We have 1/3 of the number of fishermen and women in Britain than the French do, whilst 4 times the coastline, 3.5 times the coastline. And that's one of the deficiencies of how we have allowed our natural resources to atrophy and waste and hand them over to the depredations of French trawlers, industrial super trawlers. And of course, we flooded all our coal mines. But that my affection for coal, clean coal, carbon captured coal will never die. But I won't walk around the COP26 conference talking about it. I need to go, Steve, because I've got another Steve on the line. My old friend with whom I've traveled the world, served in Parliament for decades with, even though he's a Conservative, he is genuinely a friend of mine, and it's always a pleasure to interview him. Steve Norris, thank you for joining me on the mother of all talk shows. We're short of time, and I'm coming to you from the delightful Milton Keynes, which is a veritable Paris. I'm in a hotel room in Milton Keynes.
I can't hear George.
Surreal. Say that again, Steve. We've got a problem. What a pity. I'm going to ask Steve Norris about Rishi Sunak because the British Chancellor walked on water during the period of furlough and beneficence from the British state. 80% of your wages not to go to work, bounce back loans to companies, many of which will never be repaid. Subventions to the hospitality industry, for example, where you were paid by the state to eat out and help out, and thus fueled another spike in the coronavirus. It was untold largesse that Rishi Sunak was doling out. And he was looking every inch, he's rather short actually, but every inch the next Prime Minister. He seemed to be everything that Boris Johnson was not. Not least he had plenty of money, which Boris Johnson does not. But lately, the Tories have begun to turn against him. And they see him as a closet socialist and a closet Green. And I want to hear people's points of view on that, particularly Steve Norris, if we can get him back. But Kenny was another man who was at the Killing Kelly film show in South London the other night. And he turns out to be not just an Elvis sound-alike, but an Elvis look-alike. Kenny. Lordy, 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 Miss Claudie.
Hi,
You're
George.
on. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I actually phoned up to pick a bone with you, my friend.
Oh, go ahead.
You said that if I posted the photograph on Twitter of you and I, that you would follow me back. You said that to me in person. Then
I did. It was a Solomon binding commitment. I honestly didn't see that picture. So kindly post it again, and I'll do that.
Right. But
thanks, Kenny. I'm going back to Steve Norris. Not because he's more important than you, Kenny, although he is, but because we've only a few minutes left in the show, and Steve Norris joins me at absolutely no expense. Steve, we wouldn't like to waste the fee. Before you were, or while you were cut off, I was making the point that Rishi Sunak walked on water just a few months ago, and now I'm seeing briefings and sniping against them all over the place. What's happened?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that there are two Tory parties now. There's the Tory party that you might call, if you like, inspired by Thatcher, believes in a low-tax economy, believes that the state should withdraw from many of the activities in which it could otherwise be engaged. And for those people, and Sunak is probably closer to them than he is to the other side of this debate, for those sort of people, what's going on at the moment financially is appalling. This is no longer a Tory party, I hear a lot of my friends say. On the other hand, there are those who say, look, we've just been through a pandemic. Last year, the government spent close on £400 billion, as you well know. And therefore, right now, we have to do a few things to stimulate the economy, to get that growth going. And of course, in particular, to make sure that we start the process of levelling up. And that's going to mean higher taxes, higher spending, and not something you might traditionally associate with Conservatives. I think worrying about Rishi Sunak's profile is kind of missing the point. There's a deeper thing going on here, George, which is, as I say, this sense in which the Tory party is finding itself divided on this crucial issue of just what does the party stand for these days.
Well, Boris Johnson, of course, stands for all things to all men. He's been through multiple phases, and I know that you have been critical of him in the past, as I have. As Rishi Sunak rose, it seemed to me that Boris Johnson began to fall. Sunak falling doesn't seem correspondingly to have seen a rise in shares of Boris Johnson. Is that how it seems to you?
Yeah, it does. But I think, George, to be fair, you've been in politics long enough. You and I, pretty much the same number of years. I don't read too much into this. I think there's no doubt that, Sunak, for example, is seen by many Tories as the obvious heir apparent to Boris Johnson. And Boris, like most leaders, probably doesn't actually care too much for people who are too close to him and are being talked about as their successor. So there'll be some tensions there. But the real tensions are actually among, many of the members of Parliament, particularly on the Conservative benches, who do see this dichotomy between the old traditional Tory, as I say, kind of Thatcherite, if you like, low tax, low spend economy, get the state out of your life, give you more of your life back, control more of your own life, and so on. Much of that, I might say, I have some sympathy with myself. And those who say, in the wake of the pandemic, where we spent an incalculable amount of money, as most countries around the world did, in order to try and stem the impact of the pandemic, we now are facing a different paradigm. We made a great virtue of austerity. And when opposition parties complained about austerity, we said, well, look, we've got to get spending under control. This was very much the George Osborne line. Nowadays, I think there's another, if you like, another proposition out there, which is maybe we do need to start spending more. Maybe we do need a higher wage economy. And that particularly, of course, is true for those of us like you and me, both of whom who voted for Brexit, on the basis that we did not want to mainline on cheap Eastern European labour again. And we wanted to actually increase the wealth of our own people, particularly in the north of England. That's where the real dichotomy lies, I think, in the Tory party.
It is a fascinating dichotomy, and neither is it a false one. It's very real, as you described. But it's really a trichotomy now, because what we have is a group of people in the Conservative Party that appear to have taken their marching orders from Greta Thunberg. The Tory David Cameron hugged a hoodie, but he also hugged a husky. But a section of the Tory party now seems to have gone rather green at the gills.
You could say that. That's a very good description. I mean, my own personal view of Greta is that she's a well-meaning young lady, but it really is quite extraordinary that she gets the amount of attention she gets. I mean, she has a point of view, of course, but there are others who point out that in pursuit of, a carbon-free economy by 2030, 2040, 2050, whichever date you choose, this country is imposing an enormous cost on itself. And when you consider that we already have one of the best records globally in terms of addressing climate change, and that, Mr. Xi, who isn't actually going to be at COP26, and Mr. Putin, who isn't going to be at COP26, both could arguably be far worse offenders than the UK in terms of the impact of climate change. There are some of us who say, can we get a little bit of realism back to this debate? I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to ask, George. I mean,
I agree with that. But it's your leader that says we have to lead the world on it. We produce 1% of the world's emissions. Why should we be at zero come 2050? Although I've got to tell you, after our long life in politics, Steve, I don't trust anybody that tries to predict what's going to happen a year come January, never mind in 2050. When I hear people making promises about what they're going to do by 2070, I must say I laugh.
Well, I won't be alive to find out either. That's, we're at that sort of age, you and I. But no, seriously, I actually agree with you. You see, I do think that we have done well. It's not just that we're 1%. After all, we're a relatively small island when you compare us with other vast land masses. It's that we've actually already taken a great many steps to reduce the impact of carbon. We've massively increased the amount of renewable energy that we generate, and we're now not quite free of reliance on coal, but very, very close to it. This is all good stuff. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, is Boris's enthusiasm merely for the cameras around COP26? He is, after all, if you like, on the world stage. I wouldn't personally put too much...
Heaven forfend that Boris Johnson would just be doing something for the cameras. At least not climbing up on one of those chairlifts and getting stuck. Well, thanks, Steve. I'm sorry it was so short this evening. Hope to talk to you again soon. Steve Norris, former Conservative Minister, Member of Parliament, and twice Conservative Mayor of London candidate. It's been marvellous for me. Hope it was for you. See you next week.